Hello and welcome to the third annual Ignite Institute Political Forum. I'm Darin Smith, the social studies teacher for the Design College here at Ignite. And we have the pleasure of being with Mr. Matthew Lehman, who is running to represent these students in the U.S. House of Representatives. Mr. Lehman, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll let the students start asking questions.
Sure. Well, thanks, Mr. Smith. It's great to be here this morning, or this afternoon now, and glad you could make some time. So my name is Matt Lehman. I grew up in northern Kentucky long before schools like this existed. Went to the University of Louisville and then found my way out of state for a while. So I lived in New York. I lived in Europe for about 7 years, in Ukraine, Germany, lived for a few years in California, and moved back to northern Kentucky 7 years ago. And have a lot of friends, a lot of family here, very strong sense of community in this part of Kentucky especially. So it's very near and dear to my heart. It's wonderful to see, what has improved and what has developed in Kentucky, in northern Kentucky, certainly in my lifetime. And I think there's a lot of things to be optimistic about in this state for your generation as well. The reason I decided to run for this office, so this is for Congress. 4th Congressional District of Kentucky goes from Bardstown in the west to Russell, a small town near Ashland in the east, and all the way from the Ohio River in the north to Cynthiana in the south, so just not quite to Lexington. It's a very diverse district. We have some of the richest parts of Kentucky, some of the poorest parts of Kentucky in this district, some of the most urban, most rural. I don't feel we have been properly represented. Our interests have not been properly represented in Washington for at least 10 years. When I did grow up, we actually had some very influential, hardworking congresspeople that represented this district, and that has not been the case for the last decade. And that is why I decided to step up and run in this race. My campaign, I don't know if you've seen the signs, it keeps, it's respect and respecting, again, everybody. There's 763,000 people in this district, representing all of them, even people I disagree with, taking the job seriously. So when we say responsible representation, it's showing up to things like this. I do have to point out my opponent, this is about the fifth or sixth political forum we've done. He has not shown up to a single one. That includes in his hometown in Vanceburg, Kentucky. So taking the job seriously has to be a prerequisite to be a congressman. And the last thing, and I don't know if questions will come up about it, is democracy and making sure that we protect our democracy here. We work with democratic allies and friends abroad to make sure that democracy is secured for the world going forward. So that's why I'm running. It is, again, a real pleasure to be here. Very exciting time in Kentucky. And like I said, I think there's a lot to look forward to in this state and in this nation, but a lot of challenges to confront as we go that way. Stayed with the federal minimum wage, unlike some states that have been able to go above that. I am in favor of, there's always a balance. You don't want to, there's small businesses especially that, can be challenged if you raise minimum wages too quickly. But I am in favor of progressively raising the minimum wage at the federal level, and doing so without disrupting economic growth. I actually think more importantly to wages and making sure that people have fair wages and fair benefits and good working conditions is I'm a very strong proponent of labor unions and the ability to organize in the workplace. Data has shown that's actually more important than federal minimum wage in order to raise wages, raise standards of living, ensure safer working conditions, and help bring generations out of poverty. I was lucky. Both of my grandfathers were union machinists, one in Cincinnati, one in Kentucky, and it was that union that allowed them to take a step out of poverty into the middle class. And I think strengthening our unions, recognizing the right to organize the workplace, I think that's actually the most important thing we can do.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Brye Hussey, and my question for you is 9% of Kentucky abortions were performed on girls ages 19 and younger. Since abortions have been banned, how are you working to help these younger women and girls find jobs, go to school, and support their children?
Well, there's a lot to that question. let me start maybe taking a step back from that. It is, I, as you know, so Roe versus Wade was overturned this summer with the Dobbs decision. That triggered what I would consider a pretty extreme ban on abortion in Kentucky, which, with almost no exceptions other than the immediate life of the mother. I think this is very important, and I think this whole issue has been manipulated over years. I mean, listen, we've been talking about this since I was a child, and it just seems to be one of these never-ending culture wars. I've been throughout the entire 4th District, like I said, 100 miles to the east, to the west, south to Lexington. I have not met anybody that wants more abortions. I don't know anybody that wants certainly more late-term abortions. I mean, both sides are in some ways arguing the same outcome. The reality is, and the Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky put out a report earlier this week, that 45% of women, or girls, females, have been subject to domestic abuse, domestic violence, or have been raped in this state. If we're actually going to address how do we get to a point where there are fewer abortions, where there are fewer late-term abortions, we have to start with addressing and holding people accountable for these types of abuse. The other issue that comes up is, everyone, and even people who say they're pro-life, will often agree there are necessary medical or ethical exemptions that need to be put into place. My question always comes back to them, well, who makes that choice? And it really drives me crazy that, that there is a part of our population, people in Frankfurt, people in DC, people in the courts, who think that women are not capable of making their own moral and healthcare decisions. I do not believe it helps anybody to get prosecutors, courts, the Attorney General involved in these complex decisions. So my position is, and I'm running for an office in DC, is I do believe we can legislate and have standard minimum guarantees to privacy and security and access to health care for women in this country. And that's how I would approach this issue.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Sophia Humbert, and my question is, why nearly 60 years after the passing of the Equal Pay Act, women still earn an average of $650,000 less than their male counterparts, and this gap is even larger for women of color. What can you do to help close the pay gap for women of Kentucky?
That's also an excellent question. And this has been, well, as you mentioned, so the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first initiated in 1972, never quite got over the line in time. And again, I guess there maybe not too many people here old enough to remember there's a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who, and it reminds me a lot of this debate about abortion and reproductive rights, where I think the whole thing has just been manipulated. What the Equal Rights Amendment was trying to do, I mean, Kentucky was one of the states in the 1970s that actually passed that constitutional amendment. And then somehow in the 80s, there was a certain fringe of the kind of conservative people that manipulated the language of that and went on a propaganda campaign to somehow discredit what the Equal Rights Amendment was trying to accomplish. I mean, at this point, we would have to, there would be a lot of work to reinitiate an Equal Rights Amendment at the federal level. I would certainly encourage that. I don't think, I mean, these are not controversial positions when you actually talk to most people in your community. Nobody believes that women should be paid less for the same job as their male counterpart, even though that is in fact the case. There is a role for legislation in that. There's a role for trying to protect that as a constitutional amendment. So I would encourage you to get involved with trying to reinitiate the ERA. And I would also, again, mention sometimes the best way to achieve that type of an outcome, pay parity, is with organized workforce. So I think organizing and negotiating with employers is also a way to do that. So, reinforcing and protecting the rights of our unions and the ability to organize would help with that as well.
Thank you for your time.
Of course.
Hello, my name is Jillian Puckett, and my question for you, since Russia invaded Ukraine in February of this year, there have been 15,247 civilian casualties. The U.S. has been supplying Ukraine with weapons and supplies. Do you think it's in our best interest to continue to support them?
That's also an excellent question. And I think, as I mentioned, I lived in Ukraine for 5 years. I actually worked there altogether for about 8 years. So although I'm not a military expert, I do have a good sense of the Ukrainian people and what they're up against. Yes, it is important that we continue to support Ukrainians to defend their own country. And there are multiple reasons for this. One is a moral obligation. I mean, as you said, over 15,000 civilian deaths, millions displaced. I mean, so we're talking about a refugee crisis that we have not seen in a long time in most parts of the world, and we haven't seen in Europe in maybe 80 years or so. This is an economic crisis for those countries in Europe. It's a moral crisis. It's a security crisis for the rest of us. Even on the other side of the world, this war was started completely unprovoked by a man who controls the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It is not acceptable, in my mind, to just step back and allow somebody like that to constantly, to expand ambitions throughout Europe and the Middle East. I also think it's important here domestically for our economy. I mean, just down the road, there are 2 logistics hubs, at the airport. In Louisville, there's another major logistics hub. The fastest growing part of our economy here in northern Kentucky is shipping and logistics. And it's important that we have secure shipping lanes, secure air travel, secure air shipping. I mean, that protects our industry as well. So I think for multiple reasons, and I know the number sounds big when you start talking about we've provided $50 billion plus. If you really think about, again, the number of people in our country, the type of investment in our security and our prosperity, and fulfilling our moral obligations to work with other democracies around the world, I think that's money very well spent.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Emma Ennis. Black people only make up about 13% of the U.S. population, but approximately 38% of its prison system. So my question for you is, why do you believe this is the case, and do you think anything can be done to solve this issue?
It's a very good question. A lot of this comes from, and really started in the 80s with the so-called war on drugs. And the way that, especially at the federal level, the way we were prosecuting drug crimes in this country, the way we were classifying certain drugs as higher levels of felonies than other types of drugs. I have been encouraged, this actually did start a few years ago under the Trump administration. We have been able to push through at the federal level some bipartisan sentencing reforms. I believe there's a long way to go with that. I was encouraged, the Biden administration, Joe Biden recently announced they're planning to pardon federal marijuana crimes. I think that will go a long way to addressing that issue. The problem is we do have federal courts and federal prisons. We also have states, and so it's a lot harder for the federal government to tell each state how they should do that. But there are mechanisms that the federal government, and I would be in favor of the federal government providing incentives to states to, again, I would say deprioritize drug convictions and prioritize or only worry about really violent types of crime where people need to be in prison, and that would go a very long way to addressing that imbalance.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Naomi Gibbons, and my question for you is, according to multiple sources, the United States is always within the top 3 consumers of fossil fuels. The use of these energy sources produced 5,130 million tons of carbon dioxide in the U.S. alone during 2019. How can the governments help to slow the consumption of these fossil fuels?
It's a good question, Naomi. And as we know. We've seen just in the last year or so historic floods in eastern Kentucky, a historic tornado event that devastated large parts of western Kentucky. These are issues we need to start taking seriously. It is, there are multiple things. And again, I've been actually encouraged by some of the progress that we've been able to see with the bipartisan infrastructure bill last year, this Inflation Reduction Act, again, passed with some Republican support. We are making steps to be able to invest in alternative energy sources, invest in the infrastructure that actually helps to distribute those alternative energy sources. Kentucky, excitingly, is becoming one of the leading manufacturing centers for batteries. The governor has been very active on recruiting new investments, new companies. Ford Motor Plant's putting the largest single investment in Ford's history into a battery plant in Kentucky. So it's, again, like a lot of issues, there's no quick fix, but you take we have to continue to invest in alternative energy sources, be aware of, there's always going to be new technologies popping up. So hopefully some of the people here and, as you go through college and beyond and get involved in the workforce, help to develop even better technologies for energy efficiency, new sources, new ways to store and distribute energy, and that's what we have to keep doing. We just, we can't stop. We can't stop the economy. I also, again, sometimes think, sometimes the messaging around this is poor, and we tell people, hey, if you take shorter showers or eat less hamburgers, we're going to save the environment. And in the reality, that's not true. So much of what we're dealing with is much, much larger, and most of it has to do with the way we produce energy, distribute energy, and use energy. And, if we are going to take a serious effort at making sure we have a nice environment to live on this earth and disrupt it as least as possible, it's the investments in novel forms of energy production and distribution.
Thank you.
Of course.
Hello, my name is Mary Hollon. My question is, according to the CDC, there were 1,498 deaths due to synthetic opioid overdoses in Kentucky in 2020, which is a 51% increase over the prior year. Is there something that you would do about these overdoses in Kentucky and other states?
There's a lot I would like to do. I'd encourage, I actually wrote a lengthy op-ed, and he was published in the Enquirer a few weeks ago. This issue, to understand how to address this issue, I think a brief history. So, fentanyl and other opioids, they've actually been in this country and have been used by the medical community for a long time. Fentanyl was introduced in the U.S. in 1968. A lot of people don't know that. And it had been used to treat chronic pain successfully. Doctors understood how to prescribe it appropriately, and we did not have the same levels or issues of abuse as we see now. Starting in the 1990s, and it was U.S. domestic drug manufacturers. So in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, California, it was our pharmaceutical industry developed novel forms of highly potent and frankly turns out to be highly addictive opioids and synthetic opioids. And these new formulations were illegally marketed. They were, I think at one point, almost 30% of physicians in this country were being paid by opioid manufacturers to distribute these. So these illegal kickbacks and marketing tactics led to a situation where we have a very significant dependence problem. And opioids are not easy to become unaddicted from. You just cannot stop cold turkey. And so in 2015, and part of the reason why we're seeing this spike now, it's very clear. So in 2015, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, at the federal level decided, maybe it was well-intentioned, but they decided to crack down on the pill mills, crack down on the pharmacies that were overprescribing these opioids. The problem is that was done without any serious effort or treating the dependence problem. So we concentrated on that, but what happened was we still had a dependent population. And what happens when you have drug dependence, you will find a supplier. And right now, as you mentioned, there's a lot of cheap synthetic opioids. They appear to be coming mostly from Chinese manufacturers. Most of them appear to be coming through ports of entry on the West Coast, in California and Washington. And I think it's worth our time and our resources to make sure at those ports of entry, and also on the southern border, that we can prevent as much of that from coming into this country as possible. But again, history has also shown us just stopping that is not going to work. We'll have domestic manufacturers. There will always be a supplier finding a way to meet the substance needs of people with substance abuse disorder. So we have to address the health and the mental health and the substance abuse aspects of this crisis before anything's going to get better. So that is my priority. Again, this is something I see as it's a moral obligation for our population to take care of our fellow citizens. It is something that's affected just about every family that I've talked to. I mean, it's affected, I know people from high school that are dead from opioid overdoses. My college sophomore year roommate at University of Louisville is dead from opioid overdose. So it has affected everybody in this state at one way or another. It's affecting our workforce. So when you hear people complaining about not being able to hire, or restaurants not being able to hire places and these types of things, we have lost a lot of people in the working age population that would have traditionally filled these jobs. So it's also an economic issue. And I think it's something, to me, it's probably the highest priority of my campaign. The highest priority when I get to DC is finding real medical-based, scientific-based, evidence-based solutions for treating opioid dependence issues in this country.
All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Aspen Ramp, and my question is, according to the Williams Institute of Law, 46% of LGBTQ workers have experienced discrimination in the workplace. What would you do to help stop discrimination against the LGBTQ community?
Thanks, it's a good question. And it's always, like, these are good questions you've asked today. And a lot of these are issues that don't have easy solutions. But I do believe one of the first things we can do as citizens, residents of this country, is we need to start electing people who do not use marginalized and disadvantaged people for political props, to exploit them for political power. And one of them, I don't know how much you guys pay attention to politics, but if you've ever heard of Fancy Farm, you know what that is? It's a big political festival in western Kentucky every year. And it was, frankly, disgusting this year. Most of the number of our elected representatives in Kentucky and candidates for office in Kentucky making jokes, or what they thought were jokes, at the expense of the LGBTQ community, of the trans community in particular, was disgusting and inhuman. So I think first and foremost, we absolutely have to have leaders and representatives who provide good examples and treat everyone in their district, all of their constituents, with respect. And I know it sounds hollow, but I do think that's a big issue, because when you have leaders talking down or talking poorly about their fellow humans, that gives a lot of cover for then other people to start talking this way, and gives people confidence that that they can take advantage of other people as well. So I think that is the number one thing, is we need leaders in, once you're a leader, then you're also in the media, and that message and a message of respect and respect for everyone comes out. Secondly, we do have laws on that do prevent discrimination on the basis of a number of things, including LGBTQ status or identity. And I think those are things that have to be enforced. And again, it comes back to electing judges, prosecutors who will take that seriously. And we do have a body of laws that are often just left disregarded. We also, again, I think encouraging and supporting people to take advantage of those laws. If you are discriminated against, there are resources. And again, a lot of people, I think, unfortunately, they hide or they're embarrassed or whatever. They don't want to take advantage of the resources that are available out there. And again, that comes back, so much of this comes back to electing proper leadership that can articulate this to people instead of just ignoring it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
And I would encourage, it's on YouTube. I really would encourage you to go watch clips of the Fancy Farm Festival this year in Kentucky. That was one of the most disgraceful displays of political speaking I've ever seen in this state. And I'm very hopeful that that is not representative of this state. And I certainly don't see it here, and I haven't seen it on the campaign trail, but I don't know what collection of ugliness decided to get together. That was over, I guess, Labor Day weekend. But I would check that out, and I would make sure your friends, your family know about exactly what's being said by our political leaders.
Hello, my name is Ayce Schuler, and my question is about how climate change could reduce U.S. GDP by 3 to 10% by the end of the century. Federal expenditures on crop insurance are expected to increase 3.5 to 22% every year due to crop losses from climate change. What could the federal government do to mitigate the cost of climate change in the United States?
Yeah, and I think that's also related to some of the other questions. But now, and again, I have been encouraged. We have started making these investments, but I think that we need to make sure they continue. We need to redouble those efforts. But it is finding alternative energy sources, being able to have a distribution network and the infrastructure available to take advantage of that. Continuing to invest in the research and development of, who knows what the future is going to hold, but there's all sorts of potential energy sources that we haven't even thought of that we could harness that would have less impact on the environment. So yeah, to me, this is it's somewhat of it's an engineering, research, and development infrastructure issue where, again, we don't want to reduce our standard of living. As you mentioned, it's causing issues with crops, it's causing issues with our homes, it's causing issues with our communities, as we've seen in Kentucky. So it is time now to invest in ways that we can mitigate, potentially even reverse some of the worst effects of climate change. Because these things, again, we can't just turn a switch and make it all better. It's going to take years, and that requires some serious thought and investment.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Loretta Herter, and records show in 2020 more Americans died due to gun-related injuries than any other year recorded, 45,222 total. This is a 25% increase from 5 years ago and a 43% increase from a decade prior. Is this a problem we could solve while still following the Second Amendment?
Yes, I would like to believe so. It was actually, I walked up here right behind the podium is your school's procedures for how to deny entry and lockdown procedures. And, it's very disheartening. This did not exist when I was in school. It just didn't happen. We were more worried about tornado drills. I think it's important we don't become desensitized to the levels of gun violence. And unfortunately, Kentucky we are much higher than average in terms of gun violence. And I will also say that includes suicide. About half of deaths from guns is because of suicide. So it's not always just homicide and school shootings. And yes, I don't want to be depressing. But because we have made some progress. There was a bipartisan bill that passed Congress with Republican support this year to try to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, among other things, red flag laws. So my perspective on this, and I am a firm believer in the Second Amendment. I firmly believe in the principles of the Second Amendment. I believe that we do have an obligation to provide for our collective defense in this country. I do believe that individuals have the right to self-protection. I do think sometimes that's forgotten. That we do have a lot of rural communities in this state. if they needed to protect themselves, I mean, the police won't be there. They're just too far away. We have a lot of marginalized communities in urban areas who are not adequately protected by police as well, or not always in time. So I think the right to individual self-defense is an important thing to acknowledge. But we can make progress on closing loopholes of who is able to obtain weapons. I don't think there's any, and again, I don't think it's controversial, but there are ways to ensure that people with mental health issues, violent past, people who are intending to do harm, we can prevent them from obtaining weapons of war and ammunition. And I think those are the types of steps that I think are most important.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Lillian Einhaus. About 3 in 4 Americans feel as though the cost of prescription drugs is too expensive, and many will even forego purchasing necessary medications because the price is too high. What exactly makes the cost of healthcare so expensive in the U.S. compared to other countries? Is there any realistic way to reduce that cost?
Yes, and I think as you point out, we do have by far the most expensive healthcare system in the world. You would think if we had the most expensive, we should have the best outcomes, but we don't. There are at least 10 or 12 other countries that have better health outcomes than we do and spend a lot less on the same on healthcare. I have spent my entire career in the medical field, medical technology development. What I have seen is probably the leading driver of costs, inflation, and healthcare in this country is the administrative burden. I know that doesn't make great, it doesn't sound too exciting, but the reality is the layers of complexity that have been added to our healthcare system over the last generation is enormous. And so if you look at, for example, if you look at the growth in number of doctors, the growth in the number of nurses, and you look at the growth in the number of administrators is rising multiple times faster than other types of people. So I think I am very strongly in favor of ways to make it simpler, much, much simpler, and get a lot of that administrative complexity out of our system. I don't know if anyone's gone to the doctor recently, and it's, you end up talking to one person, and they call your insurance, and they do this, and you sign forms. I mean, you spend more time talking about your insurance forms than you do actually talking to a doctor at this point. And so I think that's where we can start. I think there's some other very practical reforms or measures that can be taken to improve the universality of our coverage. So that also adds to the cost because people who aren't covered by insurance and end up deferring care, and it becomes much, much more expensive later on, and that becomes a burden on hospitals and emergency rooms. So I think, again, making sure we have universal access to adequate health care, the simpler and administrative simplicity I mentioned, and then the affordability comes in. I think there's ways to increase the size of insurance pools across state lines. I think there are some proven ways that we could also find ways to just bring costs down, and we have to do that.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, my name is Grayson, and my question for you is that from 2013 to 2019, every town identified 549 incidents of gunfire on school grounds, and about 347 of them occurred on the property of an elementary, middle, or high school. This only represents a small portion of the near 3,500 children and teens that get killed by guns each year. One solution that has been presented is arming teachers with guns to stop intruders. Do you agree that arming teachers with guns is the best way to prevent school shootings?
I don't know what teachers are here. No, I don't. I hear those proposals. I just remember my teachers, and frankly, I wouldn't have trusted most of my teachers with a firearm. I mean, I don't know where some of these solutions come from other than they're pushed by a gun lobby who's donated to certain political candidates. I mean, these are, you know, and I don't mean any disrespect when I say it, it's an unserious proposal. And, you know, it has to start with how we get weapons of war out of, you know, people who aren't old enough or competent enough or haven't proven, you know, the ability to handle firearms safely. They just shouldn't be able to access weapons of war. That's where it has to start with. I mean, by the time a teacher, you know, teachers have a hard enough job. It's I mean, I can't imagine trying to ask teachers to also become our police force. And I think that's just not, and it would probably lead to more problems than we could ever imagine.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
And that concludes our event today. So thank you, students. Great job. And thank you, Mr. Lehman, for coming to speak to us.
Well, yeah, and thanks for having me. I guess, are you carrying a weapon to protect our school today?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, and have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the school day.